All right, you ready for the payoff? I'm going to tell you about one person who fell into Christological error. I want you to try to think about this in terms of this human person, because if we make this personal, you can understand why these things are important. So we're in the home stretch now. So I'm going to tell you about one guy. I'm going to tell you about Abu al-Kazim. Okay, I have no idea if you've ever heard of Abu al-Kazim. I'm going to call him Abu from here on because it's very difficult to say his name. This is one man. He was born in 570 AD in the eastern part of the empire, outside the control of the empire in Byzantium. So he's out where heretics would go to be left alone, right? It's in a pagan area where everybody just kind of gets along. So like the Ebionites that existed for so long out in the desert, these are the people that are around him. And he happened to be the great-nephew of an Ebionite priest named Waraka al-Nafal. And this is where he started learning religion, was at the knee of Waraka al-Nafal. And Waraka al-Nafal, being an Ebionite, if you remember this, he would preach a Christology of ascent, the idea that Christ was a prophet who was perfect in his keeping of the law, and therefore he in some way was caught up to God. Okay? And oftentimes the Ebionites would have docetic ideas, so maybe a little Docetism thrown in. He learned the Old Testament, and the Ebionites by this time were using one gospel. They were using an edited version of the Gospel of Matthew. It was really, really hacked up and chewed up. It didn't have the narrative of the birth of Christ. It had a lot of substitutions made. So it was kind of a garbled life of Christ that they were reading. So this is where he learned the faith, was from his great uncle. Because he was poor Abu was an orphan. His parents had died. His grandparents had died. He had no one in the world. He had one uncle, and he had this great uncle. So his uncle, Abu Talib, is a camel trader, and he takes Abu along. He's 10 years old now. He takes him along, gives him a job as his camel boy. So Abu al-Kazim is now taking care of camels in the camel train, and it goes all over the world. And on one particular trip in 580 AD, they were going to Damascus in Syria, and they stopped off in a town named Basra. And in Basra, there was a community of Arian Nestorian monks, people that were followers of Nestorius after the schism, after the council, who had some Arian ideas and some Nestorian ideas. They would have absolutely said it was wrong to call Mary the mother of God. They would have had some weird ideas about where Jesus came from, and they're living in Basra. These monks are fairly wealthy, so when the camel traders would come through, the monks would invite them in to meals. And so the camel traders are all coming inside to have a meal with the monks, and one monk named Bahira saw little Abu outside. He was feeding and watering the camels, rubbing their feet, whatever the camels needed, and he said, no, 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 the boy should come inside too. So he brought Abu al-Kazim inside and made Abu sit with him, and Bahira apparently taught Abu some theology during this stopover in Basra. He taught him some Nestorianism, and he taught him some Arianism. Well, it's a picture there, a picture of little Abu al-Kazim talking to the monks there, with the camels and everything. And then later in his life, Abu al-Kazim becomes something of a religious fanatic and mystic. And he says that God's speaking to him. He's speaking to him in his dreams. And so he asked his wife, I don't know what to do with these dreams. She said, you should go see your great uncle, Waraka al-Nafal. He's a monk. He'll know what to do. So Abu al-Kazim goes to Waraka and he says, God's speaking to me. I don't know what to do. And so he and Waraka al-Nafal started to write down some of the things that Abu said God was telling him. And these things were written down. They're called the recitations. And that was written in about 610 AD. And the recitations are kind of weird. They're sort of garbled. Like I said, the Ebionites had the Old Testament, some of the New Testament, but they're really garbled. Like in the recitations, Jesus is Moses' nephew, even though they were 1,200 years apart. And it was the Samaritans that made the golden calf instead of the Israelites, even though Samaria didn't exist at that point in time. And it's chock full of a fruit salad of Christological heresies. You may know Abu al-Kazim by his middle name, Muhammad, and you may know the recitations by their Arabic name, the Quran. Muhammad was a man who learned Christological heresies. instead of the actual Christian faith, because he lived in a place where these heresies lived on outside the reach of the church, outside the reach of that shepherd's crook. And so when he wrote the Quran, partially under the tutelage of Waraka al-Nafal, he made this fruit salad of heresy. John of Damascus, also called John Damascene, was the first Christian to really write in a scholarly fashion about Islam. And he wrote that Muhammad was a false prophet, that having chanced upon the Old and New Testaments, and likewise, it seems, having conversed with an Arian monk, devised his own heresy. And in the Quran, you can find examples of all of these heresies. Ebionism. Allah will teach him, that's Jesus, the book and wisdom, the Torah and the Gospel. The idea that Jesus is a man who has to be taught religion by God. You can find examples of Docetism. We slew the Messiah, Jesus the Son of Mary, God's messenger. They slew him not, nor crucified him, but it appeared so unto them. John of Damascus says, and he says the Jews wanted to crucify him in violation of the law, but they seized his shadow and crucified that. If you talk to Muslim scholars today, they'll say, well, maybe it was Simon of Cyrene who was actually crucified instead of Jesus, and God did a presto changeo with their faces. But it's Docetism, the idea that Christ was not, it's mixed up in a fruit salad, but it's Docetism, the idea that it wasn't Christ who died on the cross. You can find Arianism. The similitude or the similarity of Jesus before Allah is that of Adam. He created him from dust, then said to him, be, and he was. John of Damascus explains that, saying, Muhammad says the Christ is the Word of God and his Spirit, but also a creature and a servant. This is straight up Arianism. And the coup de grace, Nestorianism. It's blasphemy, in blasphemy indeed are those who say that Allah is Christ, the Son of Mary. It's basically saying the same thing Nestorius said. You can't call Mary the mother of God. It's all of these particular Christological heresies, tossed in a fruit salad, are what makes up the theology of Islam. Now, Islam, of course, within 100 years of the composition of the Quran, is raiding the entire world. All of the cities that we're talking about from early Christianity, like Damascus, all the cities in Syria, like Alexandria in Egypt, Nicaea, all those are gone within a few hundred years. All the Christians are wiped out there because they're Muslim territories. North Africa, which was the cradle of early Christianity, is completely Muslim. And then in the Middle Ages, Spain and Portugal become Muslim for hundreds of years. And it was only by the barest of margins that all of Europe didn't fall to Muslim invasion. Those wars, the wars of invasion by the Muslims and the few pitiful attempts to go the other way called the Crusades, those went on unbelievably until the 17th century. It wasn't until 1683 that finally at Vienna, the last Muslim army to attack Europe was repulsed. September 11th, 1683, by the way. And this is what happened. This is, when you think about these Christological heresies, you say, oh, all these guys back in the dim reaches of history arguing about these arcane points of who Jesus was. Now, Catholic scholars would say differently, no, you can see the danger of these things because these are two Christologies, they're two theologies. One of a Christ who is God, who takes on our nature and redeems us and makes us better people. And the other is of a sham Christ who's not God and has nothing to give us except follow the law. One creates Christian society, the other Christ creates Islamic society. Okay? And so one example of this is that we as Christians have never, ever, ever, ever allowed any Christian soldier anywhere to force someone to convert at the point of a sword. There cannot be any threatening in Christianity because we believe that can't be right. This comes from our belief that Christ has redeemed humanity by becoming human and thereby enlightening our reason. You can trust people to make the right decision. In Islam, Christ is not divine. He does not take on human nature. He has enlightened nothing. Therefore, people have to be forced to believe the right thing. And conversion at the point of a sword is allowable. That's only one example of how the two differing Christologies create two differing religions and two differing societies. So that, in a nutshell, is an example of why Christology matters.